Constantinianism is not simply a political phenomenon of the 4th century, but a transformation in the Christian self-understanding that radically altered the Church's relationship to power, history, and the Jewish people. John Howard Yoder's critique of this transformation, articulated in The Politics of Jesus, 1972, and further developed in The Priestly Kingdom, 1984, argues that the Constantinian shift constitutes a theological rupture. For Yoder, the early Christian community embodied the nonviolent ethics of Jesus, an ethic rooted in the Sermon on the Mount and in the pattern of Christ's self-emptying. The Church before Constantine lived as a minority community, rejecting the sword and refusing to view history as a narrative of Christian triumph. The elevation of Christianity to the status of state religion replaced this ethic with coercive power and cultural hegemony. Yoder's argument is therefore not merely historical, but theological. The Church ceased to follow Jesus when it accepted the logic of the empire. His later work, For the Nations, 1997, makes this explicit by stating that Christian ethics should not be judged by what the state can tolerate, but by the example of Christ himself, whose kingdom is not of this world, John 18:36. This interpretation aligns with early Christian voices such as Origen, who in Contra Celsum emphasizes that Christians do not fight with the sword, but with prayer, when he writes, Ulgar antitinomantha tois polemies, we do not offer armed resistance to our enemies, a phrase that Yoder often sees as characteristic of the pre-Constantinian ethos. Emil Fackenheim approaches Constantinianism from the opposite end of history. In To Mend the World, 1982, he identifies Constantinianism as the Christian faith that has replaced Israel, inherited its covenant, and stands at the center of God's historical drama. This replacement theological stance is rooted in the claim that Christianity is the fulfillment of the covenant with Israel, and thereby renders it superfluous. Fackenheim interprets this through the lens of the Shoah, and argues that the Constantinian imagination gave rise to a civilization that could view the Jewish people only as a theological relic. His 614th commandment, previously formulated in God's Presence in History, 1970, demands that Jews and Christians refuse to grant Hitler posthumous victories. This commandment reveals the moral stakes of Christian triumphalism. A Christianity that sees itself as the endpoint of history becomes blind to the dignity and covenantal identity of the Jewish people. Fackenheim repeatedly refers to biblical texts to emphasize Israel's enduring covenant faithfulness. Especially the divine promise, V'zacharti et briti, E.V. Levi 26:42, I will remember my covenant, which for him constitutes a theological counterclaim against Christian replacement theology. Between Yoder and Fackenheim stands Augustine, whose De Civitate Dei became the foundation of Christian political theology. Augustine makes a sharp distinction between the city of God and the earthly city, and emphasizes that no political order can be identified with God's reign. At the same time, he accepts the legitimacy of Christian rulers and views imperial stability as a sign of divine providence. His letters against the Donatists, especially letters 93 and 185, defend the use of imperial coercion to correct schismatics, citing Luke 14:23, compelle intrare, as justification for the state's role in bringing back those who have strayed to the Church. Augustine's doctrine of the witness people, expounded in De Civitate Dei 18.46, holds that the Jews must be preserved in a state of humiliation as living proof of Christian truth. Judei, testes sunt nobis. The Jews are witnesses for us, a phrase that would echo for centuries in the Christian tradition. Modern scholarship, particularly Paula Fredrikson's Augustine and the Jews, 2008, has shown how this doctrine, though intended as protection, nevertheless reduced Jewish existence to a subordinate testimony to Christian triumph. The Greek Church Fathers deepen this image. John Chrysostom offers some of the most disturbing early Christian statements in his Homiliae Adversus Judaeos, when he describes the synagogue as oikos daimonon, a house of demons. Although his polemic was directed at Christians who attended Jewish festivals, his language became part of the cultural heritage of Christian Europe. Fackenheim does not interpret such rhetoric as an isolated aberration, but as a symptom of the Constantinian imagination. As soon as Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, the Jew becomes the theological other whose existence must be explained, confined, or humiliated. Gregory of Nyssa strikes a more peaceful tone, but he too reads Israel typologically when, in his Life of Moses, he writes that Moses' ascent foreshadows the ascent of the Christian soul, an interpretation that subtly supplants Israel's own covenantal identity. Origen, too, speaks in his Homiliae in Yeremium of the Jews as Palea Israel, the Old Israel, an expression that would later be used to support replacement theology. These Greek patristic voices reveal the deep roots of the Constantinian imagination. Even when they are not explicitly political, they often interpret Israel through a Christian lens that diminishes its enduring covenantal significance. Fackenheim reads Augustine and the Greek Church Fathers through the lens of Jewish survival. Augustine's doctrine of witness, though not intended maliciously, becomes in his analysis a theological structure that makes Jewish suffering comprehensible within Christian civilization. The Jew becomes a figure whose humiliation affirms Christian truth, a theological object rather than a covenantal subject. Fackenheim contrasts this with the biblical emphasis on Israel's enduring election, as seen among other places in the prophetic declaration, Lo ma'astim v'lo ga'altim lekalotam, Jeremiah 31:36, I will not reject them or despise them to the point of destroying them, which directly contradicts any theology that declares Israel superfluous. For Fackenheim, the Constantinian imagination is inextricably linked to this replacement theological stance, and the Shoah reveals its catastrophic consequences. Yoder, on the other hand, reads Augustine and the Greek Church Fathers as theologians who normalized Christian participation in state power. For Yoder, Augustine's acceptance of coercion, Chrysostom's polemical rhetoric, and Origen's typological readings represent the consolidation of the Constantinian shift. The Church Fathers thus become the intellectual architects of a church that no longer sees itself as a minority community, but as the moral soul of the empire. Yoder's project is therefore a call to move beyond this tradition by restoring the pre-Constantinian vision, which he believes the Church Fathers were unable to fully preserve. This line of thought can be further traced through Yoder's political theology. Post-Holocaust Christian theology becomes the arena in which these tensions are ultimately confronted. J.B. Metz's Faith in History and Society, 1980, develops a political theology shaped by the memory of suffering, which rejects triumphal narratives and insists that Christian theology must be accountable to the victims of history. Metz's idea of dangerous memory aligns closely with Fackenheim's conviction that Auburn must become a theological category. Paul Van Buren's A Theology of the Jewish Christian Reality, 1980 to 1988, is one of the most profound Christian attempts to rethink theology after the Holocaust, explicitly rejecting replacement theology and affirming the enduring covenant between God and Israel. Rosemary Radford Ruther's Faith and Fratricide, 1974, exposes the deep theological roots of Christian anti-Semitism and argues that the Constantinian fusion of theology and empire gave rise to a civilization in which the Jew was constantly marginalized. These thinkers collectively argue that Christian theology must shed the Constantinian imagination in order to speak truthfully after Auschwitz. The contrast between Yoder and Fackenheim thus reveals two dimensions of the same crisis. Yoder exposes the internal theological corruption of a church that traded discipleship for dominance. Fackenheim reveals the external moral catastrophe of a civilization that used its socially and theologically interpreted triumph to marginalize, humiliate, and ultimately destroy the Jewish people. Augustine and the Greek Church Fathers stand at the crossroads of these trajectories, both resisting and contributing to the Constantinian temptation. The biblical, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin texts that have shaped Christian self-understanding, whether Augustine's Iudaiae, Testes sunt nobis, Chrysostom's Oikos daimonon, Origen's Palea Israel, or the prophetic promise with Saharti, become battlegrounds in the attempt to formulate a theology capable of speaking truthfully in the wake of both Constantine and Auschwitz. The enduring question, whether Christianity can break free from the Constantinian legacy without losing its historical identity, continues to shape contemporary debates in political theology, Jewish-Christian relations, and the ongoing effort to heal a world shattered by empire and genocide.